Blood dripped from Daniel Foster's knuckles as he stared at nothing, seated at the old pine table in the corner of Sweetwater's only saloon. It wasn't his blood. Not this time. The year was 1876, and like many men who'd survived the war between the states, Daniel had brought his demons west with him, feeding them whiskey to keep them quiet. The eyes that had once sparkled with boyish mischief when he'd left his family's Kentucky farm at 17 now held nothing but emptiness at 32. Those who knew him called him Dead-Eye Dan, partly for his skill with a pistol, partly for the vacant look that had settled in his gaze after Antietam, after prison, after everything. He didn't notice when she entered, not at first. The evening crowd at the Rusty Spur swirled around him, leaving a wide berth for the man whose reputation preceded him across 3 territories. The piano player hammered out some tinny melody while card games and whiskey flowed freely under the haze of tobacco smoke. Olivia Zimmerman clutched her carpetbag tighter as she approached the bar. At 26, she was neither young enough to be naive nor old enough to be desperate, but circumstances had pushed her to this dusty frontier town all the same. Her dark hair was pinned practically beneath a simple bonnet, her dress travel worn but clean. The barkeep raised his bushy eyebrows at her. "We don't typically serve unaccompanied ladies, miss," he said, wiping a glass with a questionably clean rag. "I'm not here for a drink," she replied, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "Mr. Holloway sent word that you needed help in the kitchen since Mrs. Peterson took ill." The barkeep's face brightened with recognition. "Ah, you must be Miss Zimmerman. Thank the Lord. Been cooking myself for 3 days, and these boys are about ready to lynch me for it." He extended a hand. "Pete Wallace. You're a sight for sore eyes, miss." "I can start immediately," Olivia said, removing her gloves. "The stagecoach was delayed, or I'd have been here yesterday." "Kitchen's through there," Pete nodded toward a door behind the bar. "Got a room for you upstairs, small but private. Mrs. Peterson left her recipes in a book on the shelf. Men around here ain't particular, but they know what they like." Olivia nodded, already assessing the situation. "Is there any stew left? Something I could stretch for tonight?" Pete grimaced. "There's something in the pot, but I wouldn't call it stew anymore. More men coming in soon from the cattle drive. They'll be hungry and mean if there's nothing hot." "I'll manage," she said simply, moving toward the kitchen with purpose. "I'll need a few things from your pantry." As Olivia disappeared into the kitchen, Pete's gaze wandered to Daniel's corner. The gunslinger hadn't moved in hours except to lift his glass. Something about the man always made Pete nervous, like watching a coiled rattlesnake that might strike without warning. Daniel hardly registered the commotion in the saloon as more cowboys filed in, dust still clinging to their clothes from the trail. His whiskey was almost gone, which meant he'd soon need to decide whether to buy another or head to his rented room above the livery. The decision felt monumental, requiring energy he couldn't seem to muster. The smell reached him first. Real food, not the burnt offerings Pete had been serving since Mrs. Peterson took to her sickbed. Something with herbs and meat that didn't smell like leather. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten properly in days. Olivia moved efficiently through the saloon, placing bowls of steaming stew before the trail hands, who thumped the tables appreciatively. She worked with quiet dignity, ignoring coarse comments and maintaining a professional distance. This wasn't her first job in an establishment filled with rough men. When she reached Daniel's table, she hesitated. Unlike the others, he hadn't called out for food or drink. He sat perfectly still, staring at the scarred tabletop as though it held ancient secrets. "Would you care for some stew, sir?" she asked. Daniel's eyes flicked up, meeting hers for just a moment. The unexpectedness of someone addressing him directly seemed to momentarily pierce the fog surrounding him. "No," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Olivia studied him for a beat longer than was strictly proper. The bruised knuckles, the worn but well-maintained clothes, the gun that sat within easy reach, all telling a story she'd seen variations of before. "You should eat something," she said, not unkindly. Whiskey makes a poor supper. Something flickered in Daniel's eyes, annoyance, perhaps, or surprise at her persistence. "I didn't ask for your opinion," he said. "No, you didn't," Olivia agreed, setting a bowl down anyway. "But that doesn't mean you shouldn't hear it." She was gone before he could respond, moving to serve the next table. Daniel stared at the bowl, steam rising invitingly. His hand moved almost of its own accord, picking up the spoon she'd left. The stew was simple beef, potatoes, carrots, and onions in a rich broth. But after days of Pete's charred offerings, it tasted like a miracle. Daniel ate slowly at first, then with increasing purpose, not realizing how hungry he'd been until the food was before him. When Olivia passed his table again, the bowl was empty. She paused, a small smile touching her lips. "Would you care for more?" she asked. Daniel looked up at her properly for the first time. She wasn't what anyone would call a great beauty, but there was something striking about her steady gaze and the quiet confidence in her bearing. "Yes," he said simply, pushing the bowl toward her. It was such a small exchange, meaningless to anyone observing. But something shifted in that moment, a hairline crack in the wall Daniel had built around himself, a flicker of interest in eyes that had been dead for years. Olivia returned with a second helping and continued about her work, unaware that the empty-eyed cowboy watched her movements through the crowd for the remainder of the evening. The following days established a pattern. Daniel would appear in the late afternoon, claiming his corner table. Olivia would serve him stew or whatever she'd prepared that day, sometimes exchanging a few words, sometimes nothing at all. The other patrons gave Daniel a wide berth, but Olivia treated him no differently than anyone else, with polite efficiency and a certain no-nonsense dignity that somehow demanded respect, even in a place like the Rusty Spur. A week after her arrival, Olivia was closing up the kitchen when she heard raised voices from the saloon. Most patrons had gone, but a group of trail hands who'd been drinking heavily remained. "I said I want another bottle," a slurred voice demanded. "You've had enough, Mick," Pete replied firmly. "Come back tomorrow when you're sober." "Who are you to tell me when I've had enough?" Olivia peered through the doorway to see a burly cowboy leaning menacingly over the bar. 3 equally intoxicated companions backed him up, creating a wall of potential trouble. "Bar's closing," Pete insisted, though Olivia could hear the nervous tremor in his voice. "Not until I say so," Mick growled, grabbing Pete's shirt front. "Problem here?" Daniel's voice cut through the tension, surprising everyone. He hadn't left his corner as he usually did when the crowd thinned. Mick turned, sizing up the lean figure who'd spoken. "Mind your business, mister." "Pete said the bar's closed," Daniel said calmly, not rising from his seat. "Time to go." "And who's going to make me?" Mick challenged, releasing Pete to face this new threat. Olivia held her breath. She'd heard whispers about Daniel Foster, that he'd killed men in gunfights across 3 territories, that he'd been a cavalry scout, maybe even a hired gun. Looking at him now, she couldn't reconcile those stories with the quiet man who ate her stew without complaint and sometimes nodded a thanks before disappearing into the night. "Don't need to make you," Daniel replied, his voice eerily calm. "Just suggesting you'd be smarter to leave." Something in his tone made 2 of Mick's friends shift uncomfortably. "Come on, Mick," one muttered. "Ain't worth it." "Shut up," Mick snapped, his pride now engaged. "You think I'm scared of one man?" "You should be," Pete interjected nervously. "That's dead-eyed Dan Foster." A ripple of recognition passed through the group. Mick's face registered the change, but alcohol had pushed him too far to back down gracefully. "Don't care if he's the devil himself," Mick declared, though with noticeably less conviction. Daniel sighed, as if merely tired of the conversation. "Walk away," he said quietly. "Nobody needs to get hurt tonight." The standoff stretched for several tense seconds before one of Mick's friends tugged at his arm. "Another time," the friend insisted. "Let's go." Mick's face contorted with conflicting impulses, but self-preservation finally won. "This ain't over," he muttered, allowing himself to be led toward the door. As they passed near the kitchen doorway, Mick spotted Olivia watching. Something ugly twisted his features. "Maybe I'll come back for some of what she's serving," he called over his shoulder with a lewd gesture. Daniel was on his feet so quickly Olivia barely saw him move. Suddenly, he was between her and the departing men, his hand hovering near his holster. "You won't," he said, his voice so low Olivia barely caught the words. But there was something in his tone that made her shiver, not a threat but a simple statement of fact, as immutable as sunrise. Mick paled visibly, finally understanding the danger he'd courted. His friends practically dragged him out the door, and the saloon fell silent except for Pete's audible sigh of relief. "Thank you," Olivia said as Daniel returned to his table, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Though I could have handled it." Daniel glanced at her, something almost like amusement ghosting across his features. "I believe you could," he said. It was the longest exchange they'd had, and Olivia felt a strange fluttering in her chest as he gathered his hat and nodded a goodbye to her and Pete before disappearing into the night. "He's never done that before," Pete remarked after the door swung shut. "Never gotten involved in trouble that wasn't his." Olivia busied herself wiping down tables. "Perhaps he didn't want his meal interrupted tomorrow," she said lightly, ignoring the knowing look Pete gave her. That night, lying in her small room above the saloon, Olivia found herself thinking about Daniel Foster's eyes. For just a moment, when he'd stepped between her and danger, something had flickered in those empty depths, something alive and fierce that contradicted the dead-eyed reputation he carried. Morning came early for Olivia, as it always did. The saloon served simple breakfasts to travelers and the occasional townsfolk who preferred someone else's cooking to their own. She worked methodically, preparing biscuits and gravy, frying salt pork, brewing coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. She was surprised when Daniel appeared shortly after sunrise, taking his usual corner table. He never came for breakfast. Pete raised his eyebrows but said nothing as he delivered a cup of coffee to the unexpected early patron. Olivia continued her work, aware of Daniel's presence in a way that both irritated and intrigued her. When the initial breakfast rush subsided, she wiped her hands on her apron and approached his table. "Breakfast?" she offered. Daniel looked up from his coffee. In the morning light streaming through the windows, Olivia noticed details she'd missed in the dimmer evening, lighting a thin scar running along his jawline, threads of silver at his temples despite his relatively young age, the way his shoulders remained tense even at rest. "Yes," he said simply. Olivia returned moments later with a plate of biscuits smothered in gravy, with salt pork on the side. "Thank you," he said, the words sounding rusty, as though gratitude was a language he'd forgotten. Olivia hesitated, then made a decision. "May I ask you something, Mr. Foster?" He looked up, surprise evident in his face that she knew his name, though it had been mentioned the previous night. "Depends on the question," he replied cautiously. "Why did you intervene last night?" The question had kept her awake longer than she cared to admit. Daniel considered his response, cutting into a biscuit with methodical precision. "Man shouldn't talk to a woman like that," he finally said. "My mother would have taken a switch to me." The answer surprised a small laugh from Olivia. "So it was your mother's voice you heard?" Something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Maybe. Been a long time since I listened to her, though." Olivia studied him for a moment longer. "Well, regardless of your reasons, thank you." She turned to go, but his voice stopped her. "Miss Zimmerman." She looked back, surprised he knew her name as well. "Be careful around men like that," he said, his voice low. "They don't forget slights easily, real or imagined." "I've handled difficult men before, Mr. Foster," she replied evenly. "I don't doubt it," he said, "but Mick Thornton has a particular reputation for holding grudges." Olivia felt a chill at the warning. "I'll keep that in mind." As she returned to the kitchen, she couldn't help wondering about the contradictions of Daniel Foster. A dangerous man warning her about other dangerous men. a loner who'd inserted himself into a conflict not his own, a man with dead eyes who'd shown a flash of something like protectiveness. The day passed with its usual rhythms, but Olivia found herself watching the door more often than necessary. Daniel didn't return for lunch, which was his usual pattern, but she found herself disappointed nonetheless. When evening came, the saloon filled with its regular crowd, ranch hands from nearby spreads, a few travelers passing through, local businessmen stopping for a drink before heading home. Pete handled the bar while Olivia managed the food, weaving between tables with practiced ease. Daniel arrived just after sundown, taking his usual table. Before Olivia could approach, the bat-wing doors swung open again to admit a well-dressed man flanked by two obvious gunmen. The saloon quieted perceptibly. "Ah, the hospitality of Sweetwater never disappoints," the newcomer announced, removing his immaculate hat to reveal silver-streaked dark hair. "Peter, my friend, a bottle of your finest." Pete hurried to comply, his usual joviality dampened to nervous deference. The man made his way to a central table, his bodyguards taking positions that allowed them to watch the room. "Who is that?" Olivia whispered to Pete as he retrieved a bottle from beneath the bar. "Randall Walsh," Pete replied under his breath. "Owns half the valley, including this establishment. Doesn't come into town much, prefers his ranch house out west." Olivia assessed Walsh with a practiced eye. His clothes spoke of wealth, his manner of someone accustomed to power, and the men with him of someone with enemies. "Best service him first," Pete advised. "He don't like waiting." Olivia nodded, loading a tray with glasses and the bottle Pete had selected. As she approached Walsh's table, she felt eyes following her, not just Walsh's appreciative gaze, but Daniel's watchful one from the corner. "Good evening, sir," she greeted Walsh professionally. "Welcome to the Rusty Spur." Walsh looked her over with undisguised interest. "You're new," he observed, "and a significant improvement over old Mrs. Peterson." "Miss Zimmerman is handling the kitchen while Mrs. Peterson recovers," Pete explained, hovering nearby. "Excellent decision," Walsh smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "Tell me, Miss Zimmerman, what delights might you have prepared this evening?" "Beef stew, sir, and fresh bread," Olivia replied, maintaining her composure under his scrutiny. "Sounds delightful," Walsh said. "We'll each have a bowl." Olivia nodded and returned to the kitchen, uncomfortably aware of Walsh watching her retreat. When she brought out their food, she noticed Daniel had risen and was making his way to the bar, placing himself in a position where he could better observe Walsh's table. The evening progressed, Walsh holding court at his table, occasionally summoning Olivia for refills or second helpings. His manner remained politely appreciative, but something in his gaze made her skin crawl, a possessive assessment that spoke of a man used to taking what he wanted. It was nearly closing time when Walsh finally rose, dropping several gold coins on the table. "Excellent meal, Miss Zimmerman," he declared. "I'll be sure to visit more often now that the cuisine has improved so dramatically." "Thank you, sir," Olivia responded automatically. Walsh donned his hat, then paused. "In fact, I'm hosting a gathering at my ranch this weekend. Several business associates from back east are visiting. I find myself in need of someone to oversee the kitchen for the event." Olivia hesitated, sensing a trap in the seemingly innocuous offer. "I'm afraid I'm committed to Mr. Wallace." "Pete won't mind," Walsh interrupted smoothly. "Will you, Pete?" Pete, wiping glasses nearby, forced a smile. "Course not, Mr. Walsh. Whatever you need." Walsh turned back to Olivia with a triumphant smile. "Settled then. I'll send a wagon for you Saturday morning." He tipped his hat. "Good evening, Miss Zimmerman." As Walsh and his men departed, the tension in the saloon eased noticeably. Conversations resumed, the piano player returned to his instrument, and the normal buzz of activity filled the room once more. Olivia approached Pete at the bar, her expression controlled but concerned. "I don't recall agreeing to work at Mr. Walsh's ranch," she said quietly. Pete sighed, glancing around before responding in hushed tones. "Look, Miss Zimmerman, Walsh ain't someone you say no to in these parts. He owns the mortgage on this place, half the businesses in town, and has the sheriff in his pocket. That doesn't give him the right to commandeer my services," Olivia countered. "No, it doesn't," came Daniel's voice from beside them, startling them both. Neither had noticed him approach. "But Pete's right. Walsh is used to getting his way." Olivia faced him directly. "And that makes it acceptable?" "Didn't say that," Daniel replied calmly. "Just confirming the facts." Pete shifted uncomfortably. "Ms. Zimmerman, I apologize for speaking for you, but crossing Walsh—" He trailed off, the implication clear. Olivia squared her shoulders. "I've dealt with men like him before." "Not like him," Daniel said quietly. "He plays a longer game than men like Thornton." Something in his tone made Olivia study him more closely. "You know him?" "Know of him," Daniel corrected. "Our paths have crossed." Pete excused himself to serve another customer, leaving Olivia and Daniel in an island of relative privacy at the end of the bar. "What exactly happens at these gatherings Mr. Walsh hosts?" Olivia asked, already suspecting the answer. Daniel's expression remained neutral, but his eyes darkened. "Business discussions, card games, entertainment of various sorts." He paused. "Not all of it suitable for someone of your position." "You mean not all of it legal?" Olivia translated. Daniel didn't confirm or deny, but his silence was answer enough. "I see," Olivia said, her mind working through the implications. "And if I refuse to go?" "Walsh isn't used to rejection," Daniel replied. "He might make things difficult for you, for Pete." Olivia absorbed this, frustration evident in the set of her shoulders. "So I have no choice but to play along with his game." "There are always choices," Daniel said, "just not always good ones." Their eyes met, and for the first time, Olivia saw something more than emptiness in Daniel's gaze, a spark of understanding, perhaps even respect. "Thank you for your candor, Mr. Foster," she said finally. Daniel nodded once. "Be careful around Walsh, Miss Zimmerman. He collects people like some men collect horses for use and status." With that cryptic warning, he returned to his table, leaving Olivia with much to consider as she finished her evening duties. The next few days passed with a growing tension Olivia couldn't quite shake. Daniel continued his pattern of appearing for the evening meal, sometimes breakfast as well, but their interactions remained brief. She sensed he was watching, assessing, perhaps even concerned in his reserved way, but the walls around him remained firmly intact. Saturday morning arrived all too quickly. Olivia packed a small bag with essentials, having decided that compliance was her safest strategy for now. She would assess the situation at Walsh's ranch and proceed accordingly. The promised wagon arrived just after dawn, driven by one of Walsh's men, not one of the gunmen who'd accompanied him to the saloon, but clearly cut from similar cloth. "Ready, miss?" he asked without bothering to introduce himself. "Yes," Olivia replied, climbing up beside him with the dignity that had become her armor. As the wagon pulled away from the rusty spur, Olivia noticed a familiar figure on horseback at the edge of town, Daniel Foster, his hat pulled low, watching her departure with an inscrutable expression. Their eyes met briefly before the wagon turned onto the main road, heading west toward Walsh's ranch. The journey took nearly 2 hours, the terrain gradually changing from flat grassland to rolling hills dotted with stands of pine and oak. Finally, they crested a rise, and Walsh's ranch house came into view, a sprawling 2-story structure that would have looked more at home in Boston or New York than the frontier. "Impressive, ain't it?" the driver commented, the first words he'd spoken since they'd left town. "Indeed," Olivia replied neutrally, taking in not just the house but the outbuildings, corrals, and bunkhouses that constituted the headquarters of Walsh's operation. It was less a working ranch, she noted, than a Western fiefdom. The wagon pulled up before the main house, where a housekeeper waited on the porch, a severe-looking woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun. "Miss Zimmerman," she greeted without warmth. I'm Mrs. Baxter, head of the household staff. Mr. Walsh instructed me to show you to the kitchen and explain your duties. Olivia followed Mrs. Baxter inside, maintaining her composure despite the woman's chilly reception. The house's interior was as impressive as its exterior: imported furniture, expensive rugs, artwork that seemed incongruous in a frontier setting. The kitchen, at least, was practical and well-equipped. Mrs. Baxter outlined the menu Walsh had requested for the evening's dinner, an elaborate multi-course affair for 12 guests. The supplies have been delivered, Mrs. Baxter concluded. Kitchen staff will assist with preparation and service. Mr. Walsh expects everything to be perfect. The warning in her tone was unmistakable. I understand, Olivia said. When will the guests arrive? Around 7, dinner at 8. Mrs. Baxter checked her pocket watch. That gives you just under 10 hours to prepare. Left alone in the kitchen, Olivia took stock of her surroundings and the ingredients at her disposal. The task before her was challenging, but not impossible. She'd managed kitchens for fine households in St. Louis before circumstances forced her westward. Throughout the day, she directed the kitchen staff 2 young women and a boy who seemed to fear Mrs. Baxter's wrath more than anything with quiet efficiency. By late afternoon, preparations were well underway, the kitchen filled with savory aromas as sauces simmered and roasts cooked. Olivia was checking the roast when she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she found Randall Walsh watching her from the kitchen doorway, a satisfied expression on his face. Miss Zimmerman, he greeted, stepping into her domain. Everything smells delightful. Thank you, Mr. Walsh, she replied, maintaining a professional distance. Dinner will be ready at 8 as requested. Walsh moved closer, ostensibly to inspect the preparations, but invading her personal space in the process. I knew you'd be perfect for this, he said, his voice lowered. A woman of obvious talents. Olivia stepped sideways, creating distance under the pretense of checking a pot on the stove. Your guests will be pleased, I hope. Walsh smiled, noting her evasion but seemingly amused rather than offended. Oh, I'm certain they will be. Some of them have traveled a very long way for tonight's entertainment. Something in his tone made Olivia look up sharply. Walsh was watching her with calculating eyes, assessing her reaction. I should return to my preparations, Olivia said evenly. There's still much to do. Walsh nodded, accepting the deflection for now. Of course. I'll leave you to it. He paused at the doorway. Oh, and Miss Zimmerman, I'd like you to personally serve the main course this evening. My guests would appreciate a fresh face. After he left, Olivia allowed herself a moment of unease. Walsh's intentions were becoming clearer, and none of the possibilities were comforting. She considered her options, limited as they were. The ranch was miles from town, and she had no means of transportation. For now, she would continue as planned, looking for an opportunity to extricate herself from what was increasingly feeling like a trap. By 7:30, guests had begun to arrive, wealthy men in fine clothes, some accompanied by women whose painted faces and bold manners marked them as professionals of a certain type. Olivia remained in the kitchen, sending dishes out with the staff, but Walsh's instruction that she serve the main course loomed over her. At precisely 8 o'clock, Mrs. Baxter appeared in the kitchen doorway. They're ready for the roast, she announced. Mr. Walsh insists you bring it out yourself. Olivia smoothed her apron, centered herself, and carefully lifted the platter holding the crown roast. With practiced grace, she carried it through to the dining room, where conversation hummed around the long table laden with crystal, silver, and fine china. Ah, here she is, Walsh announced as she entered. Gentlemen, the chef responsible for our feast tonight, Miss Zimmerman. 12 pairs of eyes turned to assess her, most with the same calculating look Walsh himself had displayed earlier. Olivia placed the roast at the center of the table, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the uncomfortable scrutiny. A beautiful woman and a talented cook, remarked one of the guests, a portly man with an Eastern accent. You always find the most interesting Staff, Randall? Laughter rippled around the table at the implication. Olivia began to step back, planning to return to the kitchen when Walsh's hand caught her wrist. "Miss Zimmerman will be joining us for the remainder of the evening," he announced. "Once dinner is concluded, of course." Olivia stiffened, keeping her voice low. "Mr. Walsh, I'm needed in the kitchen." "The staff can manage the cleaning up," Walsh replied, his grip tightening slightly. "I insist." Before Olivia could respond, a commotion at the entrance to the dining room drew everyone's attention. One of Walsh's men appeared, leaning in to whisper urgently in his employer's ear. Walsh's expression darkened momentarily before smoothing into a practiced smile. "Please excuse me for a moment, gentlemen. A small matter requires my attention." He released Olivia's wrist. "Please, continue enjoying your meal." As Walsh strode from the room, Olivia seized the opportunity to retreat to the kitchen, her mind racing. Whatever interruption had occurred might provide her chance to leave, but how? And to where? Her questions were answered moments later when Mrs. Baxter burst into the kitchen, her usual composure shattered. "Riders approaching," she announced. "Armed men. Mr. Walsh wants everyone out of sight." The kitchen staff exchanged alarmed glances. One of the young women began to cry silently. "Who are they?" Olivia asked, maintaining her calm despite her racing heart. Mrs. Baxter's lips thinned. "Trouble. That's all you need to know." She turned to the others. "All of you to the root cellar, now." As the staff hurried to comply, Olivia made a split-second decision. While Mrs. Baxter was distracted directing the others, she slipped through the side door into the gathering darkness outside. The evening air was cool on her face as she quickly assessed her surroundings. Lanterns blazed at the front of the house, illuminating a group of mounted men, at least a dozen facing off against Walsh and his gunmen on the porch. Their voices carried clearly in the still night. "You're trespassing, Morgan," Walsh called out. "This is private property." "Got business with you, Walsh," replied the leader of the mounted group, "about those water rights you stole." Olivia crept along the side of the house, using the shadows for cover. If she could reach the stables, perhaps she could find a horse. Town was far, but anywhere would be better than remaining at the ranch with whatever was about to unfold. She had nearly reached the corner of the building when a hand clamped over her mouth, an arm pulling her back against a solid chest. Panic surged through her until a familiar voice whispered in her ear, "Don't scream, it's me." Daniel Foster. The relief that flooded through her was immediate and confusing. He released her mouth but kept a steadying hand on her arm as she turned to face him. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. "Getting you out," he replied simply, guiding her further into the shadows. "Morgan's men have the house surrounded, but they're focused on Walsh. We can slip away if we move now." "Morgan?" Olivia questioned as they crept toward the rear of the property. "Local rancher." "Walsh dammed the creek that runs through both their properties. Morgan's cattle are dying without water access." Daniel's explanation was terse, his attention split between their path and the confrontation unfolding at the front of the house. They reached a small copse of trees where two horses waited, tethered and ready. Daniel helped Olivia mount before swinging into his own saddle with practiced ease. "Stay close," he instructed. "We're heading east away from the road, less chance of running into either side's reinforcements." As they urged their horses to a trot, keeping to the shadows of the tree line, Olivia glanced back at the grand house. The confrontation was escalating, voices raised in anger, the situation balanced on a knife's edge. "Why did you come for me?" she asked when they'd put enough distance between themselves and the ranch to risk conversation. Daniel rode silently for several moments before answering. "Knew what Walsh was planning. Couldn't let it happen." "How did you know?" "Been watching him for months," Daniel admitted. "He's got his fingers in a lot of ugly business. Using women is just one of them." Olivia processed this, connecting pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed. "You're not just a drifter, are you?" Daniel's profile was sharp against the darkening sky. Not exactly. Before he could elaborate, the crack of gunfire echoed from the direction of the ranch. Both turned instinctively to see muzzle flashes in the distance. "We need to move faster," Daniel urged, spurring his horse to a gallop. Olivia followed suit, clinging to her mount as they raced across the open countryside. They rode hard for nearly an hour before Daniel signaled to slow their pace. The horses were lathered, breathing heavily as they dropped to a walk. "There's a line shack about a mile ahead," Daniel explained, gesturing toward a rise in the landscape. "We can rest there tonight. Too dangerous to try for town in the dark, especially if Walsh's men come looking." The shack, when they reached it, was rudimentary but secure, a single room with a small stove, rough-hewn table and chairs, and a narrow cot against one wall. Daniel tended to the horses while Olivia assessed their shelter, finding a lantern and matches to provide light. When Daniel returned, he carried his saddlebags and a rifle that had been strapped to his saddle. The familiar Colt revolver remained holstered at his hip. "You came prepared," Olivia observed as he set his gear down. "Always do," he replied, moving to check the stove. Finding kindling and wood stacked nearby, he set about starting a small fire to ward off the night's chill. Olivia sank into one of the chairs, the events of the day catching up to her now that the immediate danger had passed. "I still don't understand. Why were you watching Walsh? Are you a lawman?" Daniel's hands stilled momentarily before continuing to arrange kindling. "Used to be. U.S. Marshal." He glanced at her. "Not anymore. Not officially. But you're still investigating Walsh." The fire caught, small flames licking at the kindling. Daniel closed the stove door before straightening to face her. "Some men deserve justice, even if the law won't deliver it," he said quietly. Understanding dawned. "He did something to you. Something personal." Daniel moved to the window, checking the darkness outside before responding. "To my partner. Walsh had him killed when we got too close to his operations 3 years ago. Made it look like a robbery gone wrong." "I'm sorry," Olivia said softly. Daniel nodded once, accepting her sympathy without comment. He gestured to the cot. "You should rest. I'll take first watch." "And where will you sleep?" she asked, glancing around the small space. "Chair's fine. I've slept in worse places." Olivia hesitated, then nodded. Questions still swirled in her mind, but exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her. She moved to the cot, sitting on its edge to remove her boots. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him. "For coming for me." Something flickered in Daniel's eyes, that same spark she'd glimpsed before, briefly animating the emptiness. "Get some sleep, Miss Zimmerman. We have a long ride tomorrow." Olivia lay down, pulling the rough blanket over herself. Despite the danger they'd escaped and the uncertainty ahead, she felt strangely secure in the presence of this complicated man with his dead eyes and unexpected acts of protection. Daniel took his position by the window, rifle across his lap, a silent sentinel against the darkness outside and the demons within. Morning came with pale light filtering through the lone window of the line shack. Olivia woke to find Daniel still at his post, though he'd moved to the table where he was cleaning his revolver with practiced efficiency. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, sitting up and smoothing her hair. "Some," he replied, not looking up from his task. "Need to be moving soon. Walsh's men will be searching." Olivia stood, straightening her rumpled clothing as best she could. "What happened back there? With Walsh and Morgan?" Daniel reassembled his revolver with quick, precise movements. "Don't know for certain. Gunfire means it didn't end peacefully." "And the dinner guests? The women?" Concern colored her voice. "Morgan's not the type to harm innocent bystanders," Daniel assured her, holstering his weapon. "His quarrels with Walsh." Olivia moved to the stove, which still held some warmth from the night before. "Do we have anything to eat before we ride?" Daniel reached for his saddlebags, producing jerky and hardtack. "Not much of a breakfast," he acknowledged. "Better than nothing," Olivia replied, accepting her share with a small smile. I've been curious, how did you know Walsh's intentions toward me? Daniel chewed thoughtfully before answering. Pattern. He brings women to his ranch. Some never come back to town. His eyes met hers. Others do, but they're changed. Broken. A chill ran through Olivia despite the stove's warmth. And the law does nothing. Sheriff's in Walsh's pocket. Anyone who speaks up disappears or has accidents. Daniel's voice was matter of fact, but Olivia could sense the banked anger beneath his calm exterior. That's why you've been watching him? Gathering evidence? Daniel nodded. Been tracking his operations across 3 territories: gun running, opium, women, land theft. He paused. Almost had enough to take to the federal authorities when my partner was killed. Lost most of our evidence in the process. So you've been starting over, Olivia realized, alone. Safer that way. Olivia studied him as they ate in silence. The pieces were coming together, the emptiness in his eyes, not just from war experiences, but from loss and a mission that consumed him without offering resolution. What happens now? She asked finally. Daniel wrapped the remaining jerky and returned it to his saddlebag. Get you back to town safely. Then I continue what I started. And if Walsh comes looking for me? The question had been weighing on her mind since their escape. He'll have bigger problems, Daniel assured her. Morgan's attack will keep him occupied. And I don't think he'll risk drawing more attention to his operations by coming after you openly. They prepared to leave, Daniel checking their surroundings carefully before leading the horses from the small corral behind the shack. As he helped Olivia mount, their hands touched briefly, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared danger and unexpected trust. The ride back to Sweetwater took most of the morning, Daniel setting a pace that wouldn't exhaust the horses but would cover ground quickly. They avoided the main roads, keeping to less traveled paths through the countryside. As the town came into view, Daniel drew his horse to a halt in the shelter of a stand of cottonwoods. Better if I don't ride in with you, he said. People will talk. Olivia frowned. I don't care about gossip, Mr. Foster. It's not about gossip. It's about keeping you safe. His expression was serious. If Walsh suspects we're connected, it puts you at risk. We're already connected, Olivia pointed out. You rescued me from his ranch. No one needs to know that, Daniel countered. Far as anyone's concerned, you left early when trouble started, found your own way back. Olivia studied him, understanding his logic but frustrated by it nonetheless. And what about you? Where will you go? Need to find out what happened at the ranch last night, see if Walsh survived. Daniel's gaze shifted toward the distant horizon. If he did, nothing's changed. If he didn't, he shrugged. Still need to make sure his operation doesn't just continue under new management. You can't just disappear, Olivia protested, surprising herself with the vehemence of her response. Not after everything that's happened. Daniel's eyes returned to her face, something almost like tenderness briefly softening their usual emptiness. I'll be around, Miss Zimmerman, just not openly. Olivia wanted to argue further, but recognized the determination in his stance. This was a man accustomed to working alone, to keeping his distance. Will I see you again? She asked instead. Yes, he said after a moment's hesitation, but we need to be careful. Walsh has eyes everywhere. Olivia nodded, accepting this compromise. Thank you again, Mr. Foster. For everything. Daniel tipped his hat slightly. Ride straight into town, Pete will be worried. With a final glance at the enigmatic man who had risked himself to save her, Olivia urged her horse forward, leaving Daniel watching from the shadows of the trees. Pete's relief at her return was palpable. The news of the confrontation at Walsh's ranch had already reached town, though details were conflicting and confused. Thank the Lord you're safe, he exclaimed when she walked into the rusty spur. Heard there was shooting out at Walsh's place, some saying Walsh is dead, others that he killed Morgan and half his men. I left before the worst of it, Olivia explained, sticking to the story Daniel had suggested. When the riders approached, I slipped out and made my way back. Pete shook his head in amazement. All that way on foot. I borrowed a horse from Walsh's stable, Olivia improvised, left it at the livery on my way in. If Pete doubted her story, he didn't show it. He was simply too relieved at her safe return to question the details. What happens now? He asked. If Walsh is dead. We continue as before, Olivia replied with more confidence than she felt. The rusty spur needs its cook, doesn't it? Pete smiled gratefully. That it does, Miss Zimmerman. That it does. Life in Sweetwater attempted to return to normal over the following days, though rumors and speculation about the events at Walsh's ranch dominated conversations. The most reliable reports suggested that both Walsh and Morgan had survived the initial confrontation, though several men on both sides had been killed or wounded. Walsh had retreated to his ranch house, while Morgan had withdrawn to gather more support. Daniel didn't appear at his usual table in the rusty spur, and Olivia found herself watching the door with increasing concern as days passed without sign of him. Had he been caught up in the continuing conflict between Walsh and Morgan? Had Walsh connected him to her escape? On the fourth night after her return, as Olivia was closing the kitchen, a soft tap at the back door startled her. Hand on the knife she had been using to slice bread, she approached cautiously. "Who is it?" she called. "Daniel," came the hushed reply. Relief flooded through her as she unbolted the door. Daniel slipped inside, looking more worn than when she'd last seen him. A fresh cut marked his cheekbone, and he moved with the careful precision of someone nursing bruised ribs. "What happened to you?" she asked, automatically reaching for a clean cloth to dab at the cut on his face. Daniel allowed her ministrations with surprising docility. "Ran into some of Walsh's men. They were less than friendly." "Walsh is alive, then," Olivia concluded. "Barely. Morgan's bullet caught him in the shoulder. He's holed up at his ranch, gathering his forces." Daniel winced slightly as she pressed the cloth against his cut. Town's about to become a battleground unless someone intervenes. Olivia lowered the cloth, studying his face. "And that someone would be you?" A ghost of a smile touched Daniel's lips. "Got a telegram today. My former superior at the marshal's office is sending a federal force. They'll be here within the week." Hope sparked in Olivia's eyes. "With your evidence against Walsh?" "What I've managed to gather," Daniel confirmed. "It may not be enough for all his crimes, but it's a start." Olivia turned to the stove, where a pot of stew still simmered. "You need to eat," she said practically, "and those ribs should be wrapped." Daniel didn't protest as she filled a bowl for him and directed him to sit at the small table in the corner of the kitchen. He ate with the focus of a man who hadn't had a proper meal in days, while Olivia gathered clean bandages from the medical supplies Pete kept for minor injuries. "Shirt off," she instructed when he'd finished eating, her professional tone belying the flutter in her stomach at the request. Daniel hesitated before complying, carefully unbuttoning his shirt to reveal a torso mapped with old scars and fresh bruising. Olivia kept her expression neutral as she assessed the damage. "Not broken, I think, but badly bruised," she concluded, beginning to wrap the bandages around his ribs with practiced hands. "How many were there?" "3, Daniel replied, his voice slightly strained as she tightened the bandage. "They won't be reporting back to Walsh." Olivia's hands stilled momentarily at the implication, then continued their work. "You had no choice," she said quietly. "There are always choices," Daniel echoed his words from days earlier. "Just not always good ones." When she'd finished bandaging him, their eyes met across the small distance between them. Something had shifted between them, a boundary crossed, a trust deepened. "You shouldn't stay in town," Olivia said, her voice softly urgent. "Not if Walsh's men are looking for you." "Need to be here when the federal marshals arrive," Daniel replied, carefully pulling his shirt back on. "Direct them to Walsh's operation." "Then stay here," Olivia suggested impulsively. The Rusty Spur has rooms and no one would think to look for you in the attic storage space. When Daniel began to protest, she continued, It's safer than wherever you've been hiding, and I can bring you food without raising suspicions. Daniel considered her offer, weighing risk against practicality. Pete would need to know, he said finally. Pete can be trusted, Olivia assured him. He has no love for Walsh, especially after what nearly happened to me. Decision made, they waited until the saloon had closed and the last patrons had departed before explaining the situation to Pete. The barkeeper listened with growing concern and resolve. Attic room's yours as long as you need it, Foster, he declared when they'd finished. About time someone stood up to Walsh and his kind. That night began a strange new pattern to life at the Rusty Spur. Daniel remained hidden in the attic room during business hours, emerging only late at night when the saloon was empty. Pete kept watch for Walsh's men, who indeed came asking questions about both Daniel and Olivia, receiving nothing but blank stares and professed ignorance in return. Olivia would bring meals to Daniel's hiding place, sometimes staying to share them with him. During these quiet moments sheltered from the world below, they began to truly know each other beyond the circumstances that had thrown them together. She learned that Daniel had grown up on a Kentucky horse farm, had joined the Union Army at 17, had survived Andersonville prison only to return home and find his family's farm destroyed in the war. He drifted west afterward, eventually finding purpose as a U.S. Marshal until his partner's murder had set him on his current path. In turn, he learned of Olivia's childhood in Philadelphia, her father's death that had left the family destitute, her years of service in wealthy households that ended when the son of her employer had forced his attentions on her. Her flight west had been driven by necessity and a desire to rebuild her life somewhere new. "We're both running from something," Daniel observed one evening as they sat by the small window in the attic room, sharing a simple supper. "Maybe," Olivia acknowledged, or toward something. Daniel glanced at her, curiosity in his gaze. "What are you running toward?" "Olivia Zimmerman." It was the first time he'd used her first name, and the intimacy of it warmed her. "A place where I make my own choices," she replied honestly, "where my worth isn't determined by someone else's vision of what I should be." Daniel nodded slowly. "A worthy destination." "And you?" Olivia asked. "What happens after Walsh, after you've completed your mission?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. For so long, his existence had been defined by his pursuit of justice for his partner. He hadn't considered what might come after. "Don't know," he admitted. "Never thought that far ahead." Olivia studied him in the lamplight, seeing beyond the hardened exterior to the man beneath a man capable of great loyalty and unexpected tenderness despite the emptiness he presented to the world. "Perhaps you should," she suggested gently. "There's more to life than vengeance, Daniel." He didn't respond, but something in his expression told her he was considering her words more seriously than he might have even a week earlier. The town's tension continued to build as reports came of both Walsh and Morgan gathering men for what seemed an inevitable confrontation. The marshal's office in Sweetwater remained conspicuously uninvolved, confirming Daniel's assertion about the sheriff's loyalties. 5 days after Daniel had taken refuge in the attic room, a group of riders entered town shortly after noon. Unlike the usual cowboys or drifters, these men rode with military precision, their manner alert and purposeful. At their head was a tall figure with silver hair and a badge prominently displayed on his vest. Pete spotted them from the saloon window and hurried to inform Daniel and Olivia, who were sharing a late breakfast in the attic room. "Federal marshals," Daniel confirmed after a quick glance from the window. "Marshal Harrington himself." There was respect and something like relief in his voice. "Time to end this." He donned his gun belt for the first time since taking refuge in the attic, checking his revolver with practiced hands. "Be careful," Olivia said as he prepared to leave, concern evident in her voice. Daniel paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Always am," he replied, though they both knew it for the half-truth it was. The reunion between Daniel and his former superior took place in the marshal's office, after the local sheriff had been politely but firmly relieved of his duties pending investigation. Daniel presented the evidence he'd gathered against Walsh ledgers, copied from Walsh's study during careful infiltrations, testimonies from those who'd suffered under his operations, detailed maps of his properties where illegal activities took place. Marshal Harrington reviewed everything with growing certainty of their case. "Good work, Foster," he said finally. "Should be enough for federal charges, especially with the weapons running across territorial lines." "What about Morgan?" Daniel asked. "He's gathering men for a fight." "Already sent a detachment to speak with him," Harrington replied. "Man's got legitimate grievances, but we need him to stand down and let the law handle this." "And if Walsh resists arrest?" The question hung heavy in the air. Harrington's expression hardened. "Then we do what's necessary. But we do it by the book, Foster. No personal vendettas." Daniel nodded, accepting the implicit warning. "Understood, sir." Plans were made for a force of marshals to ride to Walsh's ranch at dawn. Daniel would accompany them as a guide, though Harrington made it clear he would have no official capacity in the arrest itself. That evening, Daniel returned to the Rusty Spur to find Olivia waiting anxiously in the kitchen after closing. He explained the marshal's plan, his role in the morning's operation, the hope that Walsh's reign over the region would end without further bloodshed. "And then?" Olivia asked the question that had hung between them for days. Daniel hesitated, uncertainty clear in his features. "Harrington offered me my badge back," he admitted. "Said they could use men like me in the territories." Olivia absorbed this information, her expression carefully neutral. "Will you take it?" "Don't know," Daniel replied honestly. "Been on my own a long time. Not sure I fit within the system anymore." "Is there?" Olivia began, then paused, gathering her courage. "Is there anything keeping you in Sweetwater after tomorrow?" Their eyes met in the dim kitchen, the question's true meaning clear between them. Daniel took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool evening air. "There might be," he said softly, "if I had a reason to stay." Olivia's heart quickened at his words, at the look in his eyes that held none of the emptiness she'd first observed across the saloon. "Would I be reason enough?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Instead of answering with words, Daniel closed the distance between them, his hand gently cupping her cheek as his lips found hers. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand, but deepened as Olivia responded with the feelings she'd kept carefully guarded. When they finally drew apart, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "More than enough," he murmured, "but I need to finish this first, need to know Walsh can't hurt anyone else." "I understand," Olivia assured him. "Just come back safely." Dawn found Daniel riding alongside Marshal Harrington and 12 deputies toward Walsh's ranch. Intelligence gathered from townspeople and Walsh's former employees suggested he had perhaps 20 men at the property, some hired guns, others regular ranch hands who might not stand against federal authority. The marshals approached openly, badges visible, flying the U.S. flag to make their official capacity clear. As they crested the rise overlooking the ranch, Daniel pointed out defensive positions where Walsh's men might be stationed. "Remember," Harrington instructed his men, "we're here to serve warrants, not start a war. But be prepared for resistance." The force descended toward the ranch house, maintaining formation. When they were within hailing distance, Harrington called out through a speaking trumpet, "Randall Walsh, this is U.S. Marshal James Harrington. I have federal warrants for your arrest on charges of weapons trafficking, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Come out with your hands visible." Silence greeted his announcement. The ranch appeared unusually still, with no movement visible around the outbuildings or corrals. Something's not right, Daniel murmured, scanning the property with narrowed eyes. Too quiet. Harrington signaled for his men to spread out, approaching with caution. As they neared the main house, the front door swung open slowly, revealing not Walsh, but Mrs. Baxter, her severe countenance pale with strain. "He's gone," she called out. "Left during the night with his most loyal men." Harrington dismounted, approaching the housekeeper with Daniel close behind. "Gone where, madam?" "Wouldn't say," she replied, "just that he had one piece of business to conclude before leaving the territory." A cold certainty settled in Daniel's gut. "Sweetwater," he said, turning to Harrington. "He's gone to Sweetwater." Understanding dawned in the marshal's eyes. "You think he knows about your hiding place? About the woman? We need to ride now." Daniel was already moving toward his horse, urgency in every line of his body. Harrington barked orders, detailing half his men to secure the ranch and its remaining occupants while he and the others would return to town at speed. Daniel didn't wait for them to organize, spurring his horse into a gallop back toward Sweetwater. The ride that had taken 2 hours at a measured pace now passed in a blur of pounding hooves and rising dust. Daniel pushed his mount to its limits, fear driving him forward as he imagined Walsh reaching town before him, finding Olivia unprotected. The sun was high overhead when Sweetwater appeared in the distance. Daniel reined in briefly on the outskirts, scanning the main street for signs of trouble. Nothing seemed to miss ordinary townspeople going about their business, no unusual gathering that might indicate violence. He rode directly to the rusty spur, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped and bursting through the bat-wing doors. The saloon was sparsely populated with early drinkers, Pete behind the bar as usual. Olivia was nowhere to be seen. "Where is she?" Daniel demanded, his voice tight with urgency. Pete looked up in surprise. "Miss Zimmerman? Market run. Said we needed supplies for tonight's dinner." Noting Daniel's expression, he added, "What's happened?" "Walsh," Daniel said grimly. "He's coming, or already here." Understanding and alarm transformed Pete's features. "She left about 20 minutes ago. Usually shops at Miller's General Store, then Whitsom's Butcher." Daniel was already moving toward the door when Pete called after him. "Foster, take this." He reached beneath the bar and produced a sawed-off shotgun, just in case. Nodding his thanks, Daniel accepted the weapon and stepped back into the street, eyes scanning for any sign of Walsh or his men. He moved quickly toward Miller's store, the shotgun partially concealed beneath his duster. The shopkeeper looked up as Daniel entered, recognition and wariness crossing his face. "Mr. Foster, something I can help you with?" "Miss Zimmerman," Daniel said tersely. "Has she been in?" "Left about 5 minutes ago," Miller replied, gesturing toward the back door. "Said she was heading to Whitsom's next." Daniel cut through the store to the back alley, a shortcut to the butcher shop 2 blocks over. The narrow passage between buildings was shadowed and quiet, the sounds of the main street muffled by distance. He was halfway down the alley when he heard it, a stifled cry quickly silenced. Breaking into a run, Daniel rounded the corner to see Olivia struggling in the grip of 2 men, while a third watched with satisfaction Randall Walsh, his arm in a sling but his bearing no less commanding for the injury. "Let her go, Walsh," Daniel called, raising the shotgun to his shoulder. Walsh turned, unsurprised by the interruption. "Foster, I wondered when you'd appear." He gestured to his men, one of whom now held a knife to Olivia's throat. "Careful with that scattergun. Wouldn't want any accidents." Daniel held the weapon steady, assessing the situation with cold clarity. Walsh stood slightly apart from his men, using Olivia as a shield between them. "It's over," Daniel said evenly. "Federal marshals are right behind me. Your ranch is seized, your operation exposed." Walsh smiled thinly. "Perhaps, but I still have time to settle accounts before I leave." His gaze hardened. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long, Foster. You and your partner both." "Let her go," Daniel repeated. "She has nothing to do with this." "On the contrary," Walsh replied. She has everything to do with this. You care for her. He said it as though identifying a weakness, a flaw in Daniel's armor. That makes her valuable. Olivia's eyes met Daniel's, fear evident but also determination. She gave the smallest of nods, a signal he understood instantly. She trusted him to act. "Last chance, Walsh," Daniel warned, his finger steady on the trigger. "You want me? Fine. But let her go first." Walsh seemed to consider this, his calculating mind weighing options and consequences. "Lower your weapon," he countered. "Then we'll discuss terms." Daniel appeared to comply, the shotgun's barrel dipping slightly, but it was a feint. In one fluid motion, he swung the weapon to the side and fired, the blast catching one of Walsh's men in the shoulder. In the same instant, Olivia drove her elbow into the second man's ribs, breaking his grip just enough to duck away from the knife at her throat. Walsh reached for his own weapon, but Daniel was faster, dropping the empty shotgun and drawing his revolver in a motion too quick for the eye to follow. 2 shots rang out in rapid succession, one from Daniel's Colt, one from Walsh's pistol. Walsh staggered backward, crimson blooming across his chest. His expression registered shock, then a strange acceptance as he sank to his knees. "Always knew it would be you," he managed before collapsing face forward onto the dirty alley floor. Daniel hardly registered Walsh's fall, his focus entirely on Olivia. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, reaching her in 3 long strides. She shook her head, trembling but intact. "No, I'm all right." Her eyes widened as she looked at him more closely. "Daniel, you're bleeding." He glanced down, noting with detached surprise the red stains spreading across his left side where Walsh's bullet had found its mark. "It's nothing," he said, though the growing pain suggested otherwise. Shouts and running footsteps announced the arrival of Marshal Harrington and his deputies, drawn by the gunfire. They secured Walsh's surviving men, while Harrington himself knelt beside Walsh's body, confirming what was already apparent. "Didn't give you much choice," the marshal observed, looking up at Daniel with understanding rather than censure. "No, he didn't," Daniel agreed, one arm still protectively around Olivia, the other pressed against his wound. "You need a doctor," Olivia insisted, her voice steady despite the shock of what had just occurred. Harrington nodded agreement. "Get him patched up, madam. I'll need statements from both of you, but that can wait." The next hours passed in a blur for Daniel Doc Wilson's careful extraction of Walsh's bullet, Olivia's constant presence at his bedside, Harrington's brief visit to confirm that the operation against Walsh's organization was proceeding smoothly across the territory. "What happens now, Foster?" the marshal asked as he prepared to leave. "Offer still stands. Marshal Service could use a man with your experience." Daniel glanced at Olivia, who sat nearby, pretending not to listen to their conversation. "Appreciate the offer, sir," he said slowly, "but I think my path lies elsewhere now." Harrington followed his gaze, understanding dawning in his weathered features. "I see," he said, a smile touching his lips. "Well, the badge will be waiting if you change your mind." He extended his hand. "You did good work, son. Your partner would be proud." After Harrington departed, silence settled over the doctor's back room where Daniel rested. Olivia moved to sit beside him, her hand finding his. "Did you mean what you said?" she asked quietly. "About your path lying elsewhere?" Daniel's fingers tightened around hers. "Been chasing ghosts for 3 years," he said, his voice low and reflective. "Maybe it's time to start living again." "And what would that look like?" Olivia's question held all the hope and uncertainty she'd kept carefully guarded. Daniel studied their joined hands, his thumb tracing circles on her wrist. "Don't rightly know," he admitted, "but I'd like to find out. With you, if you're willing." Olivia's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "I'm willing," she said simply. Recovery took time. Daniel's wound, while not life-threatening, required weeks of healing before he could move without pain. During this period, he remained at the Rusty Spur, officially renting a proper room rather than hiding in the attic, though he took most of his meals privately with Olivia in the kitchen. News of Walsh's death and the dismantling of his operation spread throughout the territory. Some of his associates faced federal charges, others fled across the border to Mexico. The water rights dispute between his estate and Morgan's ranch was settled in Morgan's favor, the dam removed to restore the natural flow of the creek. As Daniel regained his strength, he and Olivia began to consider their future. The Rusty Spur had prospered under her kitchen management, with Pete offering her a partnership that would provide stability and income. "It's a good offer," Daniel acknowledged as they discussed it one evening after closing. "You've made this place better than it was." "I have," Olivia agreed without false modesty. "But is it enough for either of us?" Daniel considered her question carefully. Since Walsh's death, the emptiness that had defined him for so long had begun to recede, replaced by something he'd thought lost forever: hope, purpose beyond vengeance, the possibility of happiness. "What if we built something of our own?" he suggested. "Not here necessarily, but somewhere we could start fresh." The idea took root and grew over the following weeks. They learned of a stagecoach stop for sale, a day's ride east, a small establishment with a way station, dining room, and modest accommodations for travelers. The current owners, an elderly couple, were looking to retire to their daughter's home in St. Louis. "It would be hard work," Daniel cautioned as they rode out to view the property. "Long days, difficult travelers sometimes." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Olivia reminded him, "and neither are you." The way station was simple but well-maintained, situated where two well-traveled routes intersected. The main building housed a dining room and kitchen with 6 small guest rooms and private quarters for the owners. A stable, corral, and small bunkhouse for stage drivers completed the property. As they walked the grounds, Daniel could see Olivia envisioning possibilities: gardens to supplement their table, improvements to the kitchen, ways to make the guest rooms more comfortable. "We could make something here," she said, her eyes alight with plans. "Something that's ours." Daniel watched her, marveling at the transformation in his own life since that first evening when she'd placed a bowl of stew before a man with empty eyes and nothing to live for beyond his next target. "Yes," he agreed, taking her hand. "We could." The purchase was arranged with funds Daniel had saved from his Marshall days and Olivia's earnings from the Rusty Spur. Pete was sorry to see her go, but understood their desire to build something of their own. "You'll be missed," he told her on their last evening in Sweetwater. "Both of you," he added, nodding to Daniel with the respect that had grown between them. They left Sweetwater on a clear spring morning in 1877, their belongings packed in a wagon Daniel had purchased for the journey. As the town receded behind them, Olivia glanced at the man beside her on the wagon seat, the man whose dead eyes now held life and purpose, whose future was entwined with hers. "No regrets?" she asked. Daniel considered the question, his gaze moving from the horizon back to her face. "Only that it took me so long to find you," he replied honestly. Olivia smiled, leaning against his shoulder as the wagon rolled forward, carrying them toward the life they would build together, a life that had begun the moment she set a bowl of stew before a broken man and saw the person beneath the pain. 6 months later, the way station they had renamed Foster's Rest had begun to establish a reputation along the stage routes for good food, clean rooms, and fair prices. Olivia's cooking drew particular praise from weary travelers, while Daniel's quiet competence ensured the safety and smooth operation of the establishment. They were married by a traveling preacher on a golden autumn afternoon, with Pete making the journey from Sweetwater to stand as witness. The ceremony was simple, their vows heartfelt, the celebration afterward shared with the handful of stage passengers and drivers who happened to be present. That evening, as they stood on the porch of what was now truly their home, Watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Daniel's arm around Olivia's waist, she asked the question that had first brought them together. "Do you remember that first bowl of stew? When you sat alone at the corner table?" Daniel nodded, his hand tightening slightly at her waist. "I remember." "What were you thinking then? When I put it in front of you?" He was silent for a moment, recalling the man he had been, hollow, purposeless except for his mission of vengeance, barely present in his own life. "Nothing," he admitted. "I was thinking nothing at all, just existing." Olivia turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to frame his face. "And now?" she asked softly. Daniel gazed down at the woman who had saved him, not with grand gestures, but with simple human kindness, with stubborn persistence, with the belief that he was worth saving even when he didn't believe it himself. "Now," he said, his voice rich with emotion that once would have terrified him, "I'm thinking that I've found something I never thought I'd have again, a home, a purpose." He touched his forehead to hers. "A heart." Olivia's smile was radiant in the fading light. "We both have," she whispered before rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. As darkness settled over the land, lights glowed warmly from the windows of Foster's Rest, a beacon for travelers seeking shelter and sustenance on their journeys. Inside, a table was set with 2 bowls no longer empty, just as the eyes of the man who had once stared into nothingness now reflected the fullness of a life reclaimed and a future embraced. The man who had sat at the table with empty eyes had found his way home, guided by the woman who had filled both bowls and hearts with nourishment that went far beyond mere sustenance. The essential ingredients of hope, purpose, and love that transformed empty vessels into vessels overflowing.